The plan is I'm going to speak for a while, and then I hope it will turn into a conversation. A lot of these sorts of meetings people come to these meetings in order to be told about rules or suggestions for how to write and how to put together screenplays. And I think I'm going to talk about really two things in that regard. One is that I don't believe at all in rules. I believe in originality, which is kind of the opposite of rules. And the other thing I want to talk about to you who are embarking in the film industry is the other quality that I recommend to you is perseverance and patience. Because of the three films I'm going to show you extracts from, one took 14 years to reach the screen, and one took 18 years to reach the screen from the first draft to the time the film opened. So you do have to be very determined and very patient. It's actually 40 years this year since my first screenplay was made into a film. It was based on Ibsen's A Doll's House. And over the next 15 years, I did 4 or 5 more films. But they actually, now I look back on them, those first 5 films, I don't think they were very good. I don't think they were as good as they should have been. And I think the reason for that was, as Monica explained, I came out of the theatre, which is a very, very difficult, demanding form to write. And I started to write screenplays under the impression that it would be much easier to write a screenplay than to write a stage play. And consequently, I think that the films weren't as good as they should have been because I wasn't taking them seriously enough. The thing you start to think when you write films is that there's a tremendous amount of liberty that you can cut from one part of the world to another, one place to another, one time to another, just like that, and therefore you have this enormous freedom which you don't have when you're writing for the theatre. And so it lulls you into a sense of false complacency because the fact of the matter is that the freedom that you have writing for film actually makes it even more difficult. That's to say that that until you learn that to limit yourself, really, to limit yourself to what the film actually requires, rather than indulging in these liberties, your film will lack focus. I had two very, the two things that happened to me in that 15 years that were formative for me were that I worked with 2 great directors on 2 screenplays for films that were never made. But I learnt an enormous amount from these directors. The first director I worked for was Fred Zinnemann, who was an Austrian who wound up in Hollywood and, of course, made From Here to Eternity and High Noon and Oklahoma and a lot of great films in the 50s. And he and I worked on a film about the forcible repatriation of Russian soldiers after the war. In other words, at the end of the Second World War, 2 million Russians were sent back to Russia who didn't really want to go, and a lot of them knew that they were going to their deaths at the hands of Stalin. So it was a very shameful episode in the 6 weeks after the end of the war, people were being hit on the head and thrown into cattle trucks and sent off to their death, which was really what the war was supposed to have been fought to prevent. Anyway, we worked on the film for about a year, and I don't know how many drafts I did. What I learned from Fred Zinnemann was that if you're telling a narrative film, the sort of juggernaut of story is the most important thing. You can't leave the path, he used to say. You can't leave the path of the story. And there must be no distraction from the story. That was his belief. It isn't exactly my belief. I mean, it's illustrated best, perhaps, by a sequence at the beginning of the film, where, at the very beginning of the film, where 50,000 Cossacks are coming across the Dolomites from Italy into Austria, and we were at the location. There's a place at the top of the mountain where there's a beautiful view of Italy that way, and a beautiful view of Austria that way, and a blank stone face in front of you. And Fred was there looking at it all. I said, "God, this is so beautiful. You know, where are you going to put the camera? How's it going to work?" He said, "I think I'll put the camera here," and it was facing the stone wall. And I said, "But there's these fantastic views here, and this marvelous view there." He said, "I'm telling a story. I'm not making a travelogue. I don't care how beautiful it is. What's interesting is the people coming across. I don't want to be distracted by all this stuff." I understood better when I went with him to see a film by Terrence Malick called Days of Heaven, which is an absolutely beautiful film. And at the end of the film, he was furious. And I said, "What's the matter?" And he said, "The film was so beautiful, I couldn't understand what was happening." So I learned, in short, from him. Of course, there are disadvantages to this. I don't mind if a film looks beautiful. I also like films that have jokes in them, and that he wasn't very interested in that. He wasn't at all interested in that. He didn't like jokes because they were a distraction from the. But I did learn from him enormously how to construct a story and how to make to give a film an enormous forward momentum. So 3 or 4 years after that, the film was never made because a new head of 20th Century Fox arrived. The film had been cast with Nastassja Kinski, Robert De Niro. We were all in Austria, ready to go, and a new head of production came into 20th Century Fox, and he picked up the script on his desk and said, "This looks very depressing," and he cancelled the film. So that was a very good lesson also in the machinations, the workings of the film industry. 3 or 4 years later, I was asked to do a film for David Lean. And the film was based on a novel by Joseph Conrad called Nostromo, which was a novel that I loved about a revolutionary period in a fictional South American country. So an enormous epic, and an enormous novel. So you had to make your choices were very important because you couldn't, there was too much of the novel to include in even a 2.5-hour film. So what I learned from David Lean was the idea that a film is generally in a certain number of chapters. It really, David thought that a film shouldn't be in more than 8 or 10 long sequences, and that within those sequences, what was most important was the final image of one scene and the first image of the next scene. He had been a famous editor before he became a director, and so he looked at film with an editor's eye, and he was so fixated on how the film flowed from one scene to another. That as soon as we'd finished the first draft, he employed a storyboard editor who would do things like 3 paintings, the last image of one scene, the first image of the next scene, and a dissolve. And Lean would look at them for a long time to decide whether it was best to cut from one scene to another or dissolve from one scene to another. We once spent 3 days working on a montage of 8 scenes to work out what was the best order for the scenes to come in. The scene was a revolutionary army comes into the town, and the bells ring in the church, and each of our characters, for whom this event means something different, hear the bells and they understand what's happened. And I had, I guess, written these scenes in a certain sequence. I didn't really care, what order they were in. And it was only after these 3 days that I figured out that there was there was an absolute optimum order for these scenes to be in, where one built upon the last, and even though these scenes were scenes of 3 or 4 seconds, so that you got a kind of an ascending sense of what this event meant to the characters. So again, I worked with him for a year. The film was not made. I left after a year and went off to do Dangerous Liaison, which was the next film that I wrote. And I guess the reason that Dangerous Liaison did so well was that I had learned these lessons from these 2 great directors, I suppose. Before I bring on the first clip, I want to talk a little bit about originality too, about not following these formulae. The American film industry is very, very hooked, and has been for quite a long time now, on certain formulaic means of writing scripts, i.e. something has to happen on, there are things called arcs and precipitating events, and there's a whole science that has been built up about these things. And I feel that the terrible effects of these ideas can be seen in American films now. That American films are so rigidly formulaic on the whole that they've ceased to be of any interest at all. And to illustrate this, I've only directed 3 films. The last one I directed was called Imagining Argentina, and was about the period in the 70s when people were being disappeared in Argentina. The film was very troubled. We had 11 producers who all hated each other. The actual shooting of the film, which was in Argentina, was great because we were way out of the way of everybody in Europe and in Los Angeles, and we had a very good time making the film. But then the trouble started, and it took a year of editing and fighting and all kinds of terrible things. And finally, they had the film ready to show, and they do these as I'm sure you know, they do these previews in America where people come, audiences come invited off the street, and they're given cards, and they fill in the cards as to whether they like the film or not. And a focus group of 20 or 30 people is kept behind after the screening and discuss with a host what they thought about the film. So, right, fine. So the film was shown in a mall with 30 cinemas in a place called Ontario, California, out in the desert. And most of the audience were under 25. And it didn't, you know, the film had actually, in those given those circumstances, played rather well. So, and I was aware that part of the reason for having set the screening in such a remote place was that some of the producers were hoping that the screening would go very badly, and then I would have to, you know, go back into the editing room and all that kind of thing. So I'm standing with a couple of the producers at the back, and the moderator says to the focus group, I want you to say the first word that comes into your head, first adjective that comes into your head in connection with this film. And somebody put their hand up and said, original. And the producer next to me went, oh my God. He was so upset at the idea of having an original film on his hands. So anyway, the first clip I'm going to show you is from a film that is, in fact, set in Zurich. We couldn't afford to shoot it in Zurich because you know, the German government gives you better subsidies. So we shot it in Germany. But it's a film really about Jung, Carl Jung, and one of his patients with whom he had an affair, and Dr. Freud, and their relationship as well. And early in the film, what needs to happen is something that's you know, a very common situation in films. That's to say, Jung is married, his wife is pregnant, he has this young patient who's a Russian, who's suffering from hysteria. He's attracted to the patient. The patient is attracted to him. So at some point you need to have the scene where the three of them all meet, and the patient becomes aware of the wife for the first time, and the wife becomes aware of the patient. And I was aware, of course, that Jung and Bleuler, the doctor who ran the Burgholzli, had kind of invented the word association technique. So I thought what might work was to play this conventional scene à trois in the context of a word association session between Jung and his wife. So can we see the first clip?
Vienna.
Woods.
Box.
Bed.
Money.
Bank.
Child.
Soon.
Family.
Unit.
Sex.
Male.
War.
Flower.
Young.
Baby.
Ask.
Answer.
Cap.
Where.
Stubborn.
Give way.
Ruefulness.
Child.
Fame.
Doctor.
Divorce.
No.
Thank you.
Is that all?
That's all.
How did I do?
Beautifully. Goodbye.
Yes. Goodbye.
Any preliminary observations?
Obviously, what's uppermost in her mind is her pregnancy.
Good.
Oh, she's a little... What's the word?
Why don't we try a useful word invented by our hair director? Ambivalent.
Yes. About the baby.
Anything else?
I'd say she was worried her husband might be losing interest in her.
What makes you think that?
Long reaction times to the words family and divorce.
I see.
When you said cap, she said where. Might that be a reference to contraception?
You have quite a flair for this.
Can I ask you something?
Of course.
Is she your wife?
Okay. Well, I want to talk a little bit about adaptations and how to be faithful to the spirit of a book, I suppose. I want to talk in this context about atonement, in which, when I started to adapt it, I don't know how many of you have seen it, but it's based on Ian McEwan's novel about a lifelong guilt held by a 13-year-old girl for what she's done to her sister and her sister's lover. The book ends with the main character, who's a writer, revealing that she has written the whole thing herself, and she's now in her 70s and she's dying. And my first instinct was to and in fact my first draft, I framed the whole thing. I started with the old woman. I came back to the old woman occasionally. I sometimes had her voice narrating, as I worked with the director, Joe Wright, we kept coming back to the fact that this is not done in the book. In the book, you're surprised by the ending, and so eventually that's what we did. We started to take away the framework, and we took away the voiceover altogether, because voiceover is something that you have to use, I think, very, very carefully, and is often, I think, in films, an admission of failure. And we gradually worked our way back to the structure that Ian McEwan had used in the book. There was a thing that he does in the book a number of times, which is he starts with the end of a scene, and then in the rest of the chapter he tells you what has led up to the end of the scene. And this was something that interested us very much. We didn't quite know how to deal with that. In other words, it's not a flashback or a flash forward. It's what we eventually called a flash sideways. And so we invented that. We tried to invent that technique and used it 3 or 4 times in the first half of the film. And I think I want to show the next extract shows how that works. I should explain the circumstances. The main character, played by James McAvoy, has written 2 letters to Keira Knightley, who he's in love with. The first letter is a very polite letter apologizing for something, and the second letter is an erotic fantasy where he imagines all the things he wants to do to her. And in a well-known Freudian mistake, he sends the wrong letter. He puts the wrong letter in an envelope and sends it via the main character, who's this 13-year-old child, who reads the letter on the way and is horrified, of course, and comes to all sorts of frightened conclusions about this young man, made more complicated by the fact that she, the 13-year-old girl, is also in love with the man. So let's have the second clip.
He's a sex maniac. That's right. What's Cecilia going to do? I don't know. You ought to call the police. Do you think so? He said he thought about it all day long. All you have to do is show them the letter. You won't tell anyone, will you? Promise. I promise. Good. If he found out, there's no knowing what he might do. You're right. You better tidy your face. I've still got to change. Thanks, Bryony. You're a real brick.
It was a mistake.
Bryony read it.
Oh God, I'm so sorry. It was the wrong version.
Yes.
It was never meant to be read.
No. version I was meant to read?
I don't know. It was more formal, less...
Anatomical.
Yes.
It's been there for weeks, and then this morning by the fountain. I've never done anything like that before. And I was so angry with you and with myself. I thought if you went away to medical school, then I'd be happy, but I don't know how I could have been so ignorant about myself. So stupid. You do know what I'm talking about, don't you? You knew before I did.
Why are you crying?
Don't you know?
Yes, I know exactly. Cecilia.
I love you.
I love you.
Someone's coming. Cecilia.
Yes, this was a way of dealing with the idea that if we knew what was going on, really had gone on, our actions would be very different from what we assume, and that was really really the theme. One of the themes of the book is that we never know really what other people's agendas are, and therefore we make mistakes about them, and we make mistakes that can ruin people's lives. And so this was a technical method of trying to convey that idea. The last clip I'm going to show you is, of course, it's very when you direct your own films, a different set of mechanisms comes into operation. This film, Carrington, which was the first film that I directed, I had written in 1977 for Warner Brothers, and finally came into the cinemas in 1995. This was the film that took 18 years to make, and which finally I could see no other alternative but to do myself. But one of the things I learned from doing it was that there are disadvantages of being a writer-director. You don't have an objective eye. You don't have a collaborator who can, take you through various ideas and hold them up critically for inspection. But what you do have is an idea of the significance of particular scenes, so that you can write a scene which has no dialogue in it, and which you know, as the writer, is a scene which sums up the whole film and the whole character that you're writing about. The director just reads a paragraph of description, and unless he's inclined to listen to you, which some directors are and some directors aren't, he doesn't know how important this particular short passage of the film is. Carrington is about a real set of people. Carrington was an English painter of the 20s who mysteriously fell in love with a gay writer called Lytton Strachey, and they lived together very, very happily for 16 years until Lytton Strachey died, and then Carrington couldn't bear, 6 weeks later, Carrington, who couldn't bear to live without him, killed herself. So I was very, very interested in this relationship between, which was not a sexual relationship, which was a love relationship. The scene you're about to see comes at the end. The film is in chapters. It's the end of the last but one chapter, and it shows that although a certain arrangement has been arrived at, Carrington is in a very lonely place. The characters in the scene are Carrington's ex-husband, who Lytton Strachey was in love with, and his wife. Carrington's present lover, from whom she was about to be estranged. She had just had an abortion and lost his child. And Lytton Strachey and his lover, and so they're all 6 of them staying at the same house over the weekend, and it's the evening, and Carrington is in the garden.
I suppose they're going to play that wretched game all night.
think it's time we should...
I come back on stage?
Yes.
To sort of open the discussion?
Yes, please.
Are there right now any questions to Christopher Hampton or... Yes.
I have a question to Atonement, because when I looked at the first half of the film, by the way, I really loved the film, the cinematography is so precise and the way it's lit. So I just wanted to know how much of that was in the script, because it's so much about perspective and how the characters look at each other. It's told through lighting of the cinematographer as well, and it's going together with what is written, with the dialogue. So I wanted to know how much of that you developed as well, or is it just...
Well, I think that I try not to put too many precise instructions in my scripts, because it kind of annoys directors to be told, you know, for example, when there should be a close-up or when there should be a tracking shot or whatever. But and every film is different, really. But in the case of Atonement, Joe Wright and I went to Italy together and sat in a. He had a friend with a big house in Italy, and we just spent all day, every day for 2 weeks, going through every scene very precisely. Some directors like the writer to be on set all the time. I've done 4 films now with Stephen Frears, and he has it in his contract that the writer must be on the set at all times. Other people, like Joe Wright, will work with you very, very closely, and then he doesn't want you on the set. Or he didn't want me on the set. So that I only visited for, there's a huge evacuation of Dunkirk scene, which I went to watch. And then I worked a bit with the French actors, because I can speak French, and Joe can't. So the work was finished by the time he got onto the set, and he worked, I guess, very closely with Seamus McGarvey, who was the DP. So I can't claim to have influenced it beyond what we said to one another in that room in Italy. But it was the shooting script was pretty precise by the time he got it. In fact, you can get it. It's published. And you can see there what I indicated and what they did that was extra. Yes.
I have, like, when you work with directors, you said, like, you worked with David Lean and you worked with a lot of others. Can you tell us a little bit more about this collaboration, and how do you think about the rhythm and space? Because these scenes that you've shown work a lot with rhythm and with space. It's very strong. So what's your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I do. I think that you know, a lot of writers who come out of the theatre, especially, well, certainly this is the case in England. People in the cinema are suspicious of them because they think it's just going to be dialogue. And of course, I love dialogue, but I think, you know, you really have to, when writing a movie, you have to see every frame in your head. You have to have an ideal movie running in your head. Now, that will not bear any resemblance to the finished product, really. If I can give you an analogy, I sometimes imagine particular actors in roles, and it doesn't really matter if you get that actor or you don't get that actor. The actor has done the job because he's been in your head, and you've heard his voice or her voice, and you've imagined that actor, and therefore that's helped you to put things into your script that wouldn't be there otherwise. And it's the same with images, that you build images in. And you have a very vivid idea of these images, whether they're going to be in the film or not. So yes, rhythm and the moving camera. I love the moving camera. I mean, you know, there are great directors who have just put the camera down and shot static scenes from from waist height, like Ozu or Bresson or whatever. But I'm more of an Offals kind of Douglas Sirk kind of man. So yes, those considerations really do go through my mind when I'm writing.
But is it a necessity to really, to talk? Or do you think it would be possible to write a script and sell it to someone or whatever, give it to someone, without really having that time of ping pong?
Everything is possible. And of course, terrible things happen, particularly in the American cinema, and writers are treated with just tremendous disrespect. But I've been very, very lucky, and 16 films have come out with my name on them, and they're more or less mostly what I intended. Although some of them are, had things changed and messed about with that I'm not happy about. But I've been very lucky in that respect. But it often happens that scripts are taken away, rewritten. There are whole gangs of people in Los Angeles whose names you don't know, who rewrite scripts routinely for enormous sums of money, 2 or 3 weeks before they go into production, and there are all kinds of unsavory practices going on for writers. But I do think if you have a close relationship with a director, and that will reflect itself in the result, and that you can't. It's very hard to imagine a really good film which doesn't have that relationship of the writer and the director behind it.
Regarding characters and subjects and themes, like how much time you spend there, or you have like methods how you develop it to like really get the characters or the themes?
Well, just to give you a general answer, I take a long time thinking about a script in advance. Typically, much longer to think about it and to make notes about it than to write it. I mean, it's no good making these rules because everybody has different rhythms. Well, my practice is, let's say with a film like Carrington, I spent nearly a year thinking about it, making notes, figuring out how to do it before I started writing. My superstition is then I like to write very, very fast. Because there's no rationality behind this at all, but I feel if you write with tremendous energy and put yourself through a really grueling process, like a marathon, writing the script very fast, the energy will somehow come through the screen in the end. It's just my. So I can write I typically will write a script in 5 or 6 weeks. 7 weeks I wrote Dangerous Liaison in 3 weeks. Sometimes I've written films in a week. Two of my films I've written in a week. Just because that's how I do it. I do it by long meditation and then fast writing.
I'd like to get to know a character.
Yes.
Is it people who are in a similar situation, or is it more the theory?
The research part.
Well, it depends. I'll tell you a story about the Jung film, Dangerous Method. It's based on a book. The book is called A Most Dangerous Method, and it's actually a kind of like a 750-page book about the early history of psychoanalysis. In this book, it says that Jung had this patient, Sabine Spielrein, and they had and the treatment went on. The author didn't know for how long, but they obviously had some kind of relationship, but the author didn't think it was a sexual relationship, and it's quite a small bit of the book. So obviously I had to do some of my own research. So I came here to Zurich, and I went to the Burg Herzli, and in the hospital then, it's gone now, but on the top floor was a small museum, Jung museum. And I went there maybe twice, 2 or 3 times. And eventually the old guy who was the curator at the museum said to me, you came yesterday, is there something you're particularly interested in? And I said, yes, I'm researching as a patient of Dr. Jung's. He said, oh, I knew Dr. Jung, I was his orderly in the 30s when, you know, and we got to talking about the Jung family and the whole his experiences as a in the hospital. And then he said, this patient of yours, when did this patient, what was the detail? Do you know the details? Do you know when the patient was admitted? I said, yes, actually, it's 14th of August 1904. He said, okay, if you wait 10 minutes, I'm closing the museum, I can show you something. So he closes the museum, he takes me down into the basement, and there is the archive of the hospital. And he finds 1904, big black volume from the shelf, takes it out, and gives it to me. I look to August, and there are Jung's case notes of his treatment of Sabine Spielrein. Turns out he treated her for 6 months. The typewritten notes with handwritten things in the margin. And he says to me, you've got half an hour. I said, well, you know, my German is kind of a... and it's about 50 pages. And he says, well, I'm going to leave you, and there's a photocopier in the corner. So there was the first third of my film. It doesn't answer your question about character, but it does in a way, because everything I needed to know about her character was in these notes. And everything that wasn't in the book that we originally optioned, which, as I say, is a very interesting scientific treatment of early years of psychoanalysis, but it doesn't go into what you need, what as a writer of feature film you need to have, which is a sense of who these people are, what they're, you know. I'm very interested in writing about, as you see, both from the Dangerous Method and from Carrington. I'm very interested in writing about real people. And then I'm very, very interested in researching them as far as I can, because it's my experience or my belief that what really happens is much, much more interesting than anything you could invent, and much more unlikely and much more surprising. So that the life of Carrington and Lytton Strachey, which, as I said, they lived together for 16 years, but they were apart quite a lot, and when they were apart they wrote to each other every day. And we have those letters, so we know what they were like from the letters. And it's remarkable. It's much more interesting than anything you could make up. So of course, if you're adapting a novel like Atonement, the novelist has done all the character work for you. I mean, I'd just say another thing I meant to say about adaptation, which I learned when I was starting out. It was very hard to get hold of screenplays when I was young to read. But Harold Pinter had written 5 screenplays, and they were published. So I bought the published screenplays, and I bought the 5 novels that Pinter had based the films on. And I learned something that I've always remembered, which is that if the novel was great, it was really good, if it was a masterpiece like The Go-Between, Pinter would be very, very scrupulously faithful to the novel. If the novel was like a spy novel, like The Quiller Memorandum, which is kind of a bit of fun, he enjoyed himself also. He changed things, he reorganized things, he wrote Pinterish sort of scenes that weren't in the book. If the book was a novel like The Pumpkin Eater, which had very, very interesting material, but it was badly organized, he reorganized the order of the book, the order of the scenes, so that I learned that you know, just try to respond to the quality of the piece of work you're adapting. If it's really good, you won't improve it. If it has problems, you might be able to help it. But basically, you have to respect you have to judge first of all, and then respect the quality of the original.
Isabel?
Yeah, I had a question. How did you come up with the idea, the opening scene in A Tournament? Because I thought when I saw the film, this is one of the best openings I ever saw, with a little girl when she's running in the house and you hear the typing of the machine. And I didn't read the novel, but I thought it's extremely filmish.
Yeah, I mean, it was a long, the writing of Atonement was a long process. And in fact, I started out, as I said, I started out with quite a different sort of script than I finished with, and a different director, in fact. And eventually, after 2 years, the director went off to do something else. And they brought me in, and I met this young director, Joe Wright. And he said, I read your script, but and I think it's very good. But he said, I think we have to start again. So that's the worst thing you want. So I tried to say, oh, fine. But in fact, he was very rigorous, and he gets the idea of the typewriter and all of that was really his. And he always works, for example, with the same composer, Dario Marianelli, and he got the composer to incorporate the idea of the typewriter. I mean, this came out of, you know, we had a conversation one day and we realized that an obvious thing, which is the book is about writers, it's about a writer, and this is a way to make that concrete. And it amused us to begin the film by having her write the end.
It's brilliant. It's like you get a very good sense of the whole style of the film.
Yeah. So it really, all of that came out of these conversations that we had, you know, and I like to work that way. I like to work. Now I'm the age I am, I find that the directors I'm working with are younger people rather than when I started out when I was working with terrifying people like David Lean. I'm now working with younger people, and I like the idea of getting the script to a certain stage, and then just going somewhere with the director and going through every inch, every second of the script, really, and talking and saying, how will this scene work, and how does this cut work, and how does this, and would it be better should we try that? And just going with a script that you've maybe done 4 or 5 drafts of already, and throwing the whole thing up into the air and saying, let's start again and let's see what we come up with. And you still don't know, because I mean, in fact, the first when Joe went in to shoot Atonement, the ending of Atonement was the old woman going back and seeing the play that she had written which she's writing at the very beginning, with all her young, you know, grandchildren and so on, and not her grandchildren, but her relatives, her grandnephews and nieces and so on, and it was very moving, but Joe thought it went on too long. And he thought something which I also believe, that as you get towards the end of a film, when you get towards the end of the film, like the piece I showed you from Carrington, which is towards the end of the film, between there and the very end, just go as fast as you can. Just really try and get that last bit to be as muscular and as taut and as fast as it can be. And so he just threw that away. He threw the final sequence of Atonement. He threw it away and just put that image of them, took them back actually and reshot that the very ending of the film, which is them on the beach, as we imagined them, as you know, might have happened if they hadn't both died. And so what I'm saying is that right up to the last minute, in this case, you can change things. But there should be a moment where you know the film is going to be made, and you know it's going to be made, and you may as well review everything before you get in on the set.
Yeah, but I remember I had one thing in the film, because I'm very a fan of the film. I think it's a very remarkable piece of art. But then I remember, I don't know quite very good exactly why, but I remember that there comes this the woman, and we understand, okay, it's just her imagination. She wrote it, and then after this, you show us again how the figures were dying. Like I remember, Keira Knightley was in the
water.
And somehow this makes me so angry when I saw the film, because it was completely, from my perspective, from the whole kind how the film was made, out of the style, and seemed something like producers came in and say, but you have to make this thing, and I always wanted to know why.
No, that's what happens in the novel. In the novel, you read 400 pages, and then you get to a bit, and she says, "No, I'm the writer. I made this bit up. Everything else is true except."
Yeah,
this.
and it was perfectly because you have your fantasies, and then.
And as I said, when I wrote the first draft, I think I felt the same way as you did, and so I changed it to have the whole film narrated by the old writer, so none of that was a surprise. But we decided to really try to reproduce the effect of the novel at the end there. And that's what we did. The thing that we added, that we invented, which is also came from research, the destruction of that underground tube station, Balham, in the war, was very famous. So many people died in it, and it's referred to in the novel. But we did some research, and we found that what happened was when the bomb landed, it burst the water mains, and so everybody sheltering in the tube station was drowned. Not as, and you know how it is. Of course, it's a terrible, terrible story, but we thought, the fact that she drowns at the end works so well with the first scene where she goes in the fountain, and the scene where Bryony pretends to be drowning so that Robbie will come in and save her. And all those water images that go all the way through, we were able to complete, which is not in the novel, but it's a kind of grace note in the film. But I don't disagree with you. It's a trick with the ending. So there we are.
Yeah, it's the only trick you really feel. But no. Thank you.
But it was in the book, and
it's in the book, yeah.
So you were really true to the book.
Yeah.
When you're adapting you adapted your own plays.
Yes. Then I can be less faithful.
Yeah. So you work differently then.
I work differently, and in fact, funnily enough, with Dangerous Method, I worked for the first time with David Cronenberg, who's a wonderful director, and I had taken the play and sort of exploded it, particularly in the first 20 minutes.
It was called The Talking Cure.
The play was called The Talking Cure, yes. Cronenberg just wanted to go back to the play, and I kept saying, well, these huge long dialogue scenes, 5-6 pages of dialogue. If Stephen Frears sees more than one page of dialogue, he gets very anxious and unhappy. But Cronenberg said, fine, I like the dialogue. Let's have 5 pages, 6 pages, 10 pages of dialogue. Fine. So it depends on the director. So I threw away all that stuff I'd done and went closer and closer back towards the play.
Mm-hmm. And Dangerous Liaison?
Dangerous Liaison is quite. It travels towards the play. The first half of Dangerous Liaison is very much different from the play. But eventually you have to come down to those confrontations and those dialogue scenes, I guess, the ones that made Stephen Frears so nervous. But in the end, he had to shoot them. He had to shoot these 2 or 3 page dialogue scenes towards the end. But at the beginning, we were able to. We didn't want to make it look like a period picture, particularly. You know, we didn't want all that stuff. And Stephen was the ideal director because he'd never done a period picture before, and he wasn't interested in. So, as somebody said, Dangerous Liaison is a period picture made by somebody who's not interested what a duel looks like. He just films it. He just films it as violently as he possibly can. And you know, it's not at all to do with recreating 18th century paintings or looking. Of course, you acknowledge the beauty of the surroundings, but you don't. That's not what it's about.
When you first started as a writer, at what point in your life did you feel that you were going towards the right path with writing, where you felt this feels right?
Knowing that he grew up in a family of sports.
Yeah, I've always regarded it as a sort of inevitable affliction, really. In other words, I'm very happy that I'm to be a writer. That's what I always wanted to do. But I have no explanation as to why it should have happened. I can't. The ambition is a very strange one for somebody to come up with. And since I decided when I was like 8 or 9 years old that I wanted to be a writer, you know, I can't really explain anything other than the fact that the good luck for me was that I wanted to do something and I've been able to do it, because a lot of people want to write and can't, you know, for various circumstantial reasons, find that it's impossible or that difficult, or and I've been able to do it all. I've never had another job. That's all I've done. So I have no means of comparing it with a normal life.
Thank you.
Yep. Right. Next.
Oh, sorry. Can you say the difference between working on an adapted screenplay or an original screenplay? Are you working the same? I mean, it's not the same, but...
No, I've done much more of adaptation than... although sometimes, you know, quite often the adaptation has been of my own, so I've been adapting my own originals, as it were. I think that what I discovered was early on in my career, when I wrote 2 or 3 originals which then were not made, that it was really, really heartbreaking to, you know, to write your own thing and then it doesn't go anywhere. Whereas you can be more philosophical about adapting somebody else's work and it doesn't go anywhere. So I tended to reserve my original work first in the 70s, first for television, which was in the 70s in Britain very, very receptive. In other words, it took an enormous amount of material, so that if you wrote a television play, you could be pretty sure that someone would do it. So I've written either for television or for the theatre. I've written only one original film for the cinema, which has not been made, or maybe 2, or maybe 3. But in any case, there's a certain small batch of films that I own, and that therefore I think maybe one day I'll be able to make. I wrote a film about my childhood in Egypt and got very close to, I was putting it together to direct, but we were sitting in a hotel in London with the American producer, and we were, you know, planning to go in the spring, and he said, you know, I don't know whether Egypt's very stable. He said, maybe we should go and make the film in Tunisia. And the next day it happened in Tunisia. And then 2 months later it happened in Egypt. So of course we couldn't make the film. I couldn't really imagine making it not in Egypt. So I guess I just have to wait until things settle down a little bit, however long that takes. But since I wrote the script already now 10 years ago, it doesn't really it doesn't matter waiting a few more years.
Being patient, as you said in the beginning. Yeah. Question here at front, and then.
I've watched Atonement yesterday, and I liked the dialogues very much. I always felt suspense and entertainment, therefore. And they're well written. And I thought once when I looked, I was watching a Jeff Nichols film, and I thought the dialogues are so real. They talk so real, like out somewhere. And I loved it as well. And a friend of me told me he has seen Take Shelter and he falls asleep because it's just boring, like most people talk. Just how do you work with, and what kind of reality of dialogues or entertainment is better in what case? Or
well, I like to write dialogue, but I can see that for some directors they find dialogue scenes kind of artificial because people speak well and they make their points and in a way that's not like life. I'm working at the moment on a big sort of epic film with a young director called Asif Kapadia, who made it. The most recent thing he did was the documentary about Senna, about Ayrton Senna, the racing driver. And over the 6 months that I've been working with him, I've come to realise that he doesn't really like dialogue. He would rather there was. So it's very hard for me, but you know, he's the director. He's going to have to make it. So I'm trying now to get the dialogue down and down and down. He was very happy a few days ago because we found that there was a sequence where we could probably go 5 or 6 pages with no dialogue at all. So that made him very happy. I mean, I obviously come from the theatre, so I like dialogue. Carrington, for example, apart from the scene that you saw, they hardly ever stop talking. They talk. And, you know, I think the ideal film, not that there is such a thing, but the ideal film is a balance between dialogue and... I don't really believe in those oppositions that people set up. At the beginning when I talked about Fred Zinnemann, I don't see why a film shouldn't have a narrative drive and be beautiful. I don't see why a film shouldn't have good dialogue and good images. I don't see why a film shouldn't have everything. But people make stylistic decisions which suit their temperament, and directors in particular have these, you know, like painters. They have these distinctive sets of images and sets of preoccupations that they come back to again and again and again. And I've never really been like that. What I really like is to do something completely different from what I did last time. And occasionally, if in a long career, you find, I remember this bit. I remember these scenes from another film, something like this. And sometimes you find yourself writing a piece of dialogue that sounds familiar, and then you realise you wrote it 20 years ago. But on the whole, my aim is to be completely different, to do things that are completely different from one film to the next. I really don't want to do, you know, something 2 and something 3. I don't want to do Dangerous Liaison 2. Because I mean, you know, it's more stimulating to do something completely new.
Isabel, no. Well.
Sorry. I have maybe a little personal question, because I thought that a lot of your films have themes with passion and desire that is not possible to live, and sexuality, dreams, but always a lot of energy, the power between something you want and you cannot get. And the question is how personal gets your work, because I think it's a very personal or sometimes private job, and I often come to the point when I write, or at least in a post-production, that I think, oh my God, I'm living the film again, in like myself. You know what I mean?
Well, I do, and I think that I also always tried to avoid writing autobiographically, with certain exceptions. Of course, I just said I wrote this film about my childhood in Egypt, and that, of course, is totally about my childhood and about my own memories. But I find that's really why I find it easier to kind of smuggle that stuff in, rather than writing directly from experience or directly from. For example, I wrote a stage play a while ago about the German émigré writers who wound up in Hollywood. I mean, Thomas Mann, Heinrich Mann, Brecht, all those people. It was about that subject. It was about emigration. It was about the various tensions and the difficulties of being a writer in a foreign language and all those kinds of things. But it was also about my own experiences in Hollywood, so that I had an invented character, a semi-invented character as the central character, and I was just able to, because Hollywood is so ludicrous and so absurd, and the experiences that you have there are so surrealistic, that I wanted to deal with that, but I didn't want to deal with it in terms of a writer of today experiencing what I had experienced. I wanted to deal with it in this story set in the 40s to show that the Hollywood was as idiotic then, if not more so, than it is now, and that it's always been idiotic, and that the circumstances of the way the studios have to run encourages absurdity of all kinds, because it does, and I wanted to. So what I'm saying is that I'm putting autobiographical material into stories which are ostensibly about something else altogether.
Christopher Hampton, if we summon up this 1.5 hours a little bit, maybe to find the end of this masterclass, you were working in the theater for a long time. You had the chance also. You knew as an 8-year-old that you want to become a writer. Your first play got accepted by a beautiful theater. And you had the chance to work with actors or to listen to your dialogues by actors, by very good actors. If you look at these young filmmakers, maybe script writers, directors, and writers, who, I don't know, maybe today it's a little bit different, what would you tell them? I mean, how can you practice, or how can you sort of learn and get better and get experience? Is it just by doing it, of course? But is there something?
It is by doing it, but it's also by sort of silence and cunning, and just observing and trying not to. I mean, what's very difficult when you start out and you're young, and you're very passionate about a piece of work and how it works with an audience and how the best way to do it. You need to retain that passion. On the other hand, you somehow need to, because it's such a collaborative medium, you somehow need to open some bit of your mind that will allow people to say, try something different here, or this doesn't quite work, or this. But it's a very delicate balance, because I've worked on scripts for a year with directors, and for 6 months you know it's getting better, and then for 2 or 3 months, you're changing things and you think, I'm not quite sure about this. And then if you're not very careful and you don't retain very firmly in your head what you originally set out with, you start to lose whatever it was that was in the energy of your first draft, starts to leak away in the welter of revisions. So you can over-revise things. And I wrote a film called The Quiet American, which was done about 10 years ago about the prequel, I suppose, to the Vietnam War. And I worked with an Australian director called Philip Noyce, who I liked very much, and it was produced by Sidney Pollack, who was an American producer-director. And we had lots and lots of script conferences every day. And finally, I said to Sidney, who was a wonderful man, but he just worried away at things over and over and over again. And I said, the thing is, Sidney, if you make an adjustment and it goes like that, and then you make another little adjustment and it goes like that, and then you make another adjustment and it goes like that, and eventually you wind up facing in completely the opposite direction than what you wanted to face in and what you must face in. And you've weakened your character, you've changed, you've been, all these terrible things that they tell you, like, the main character is too passive, or the main character, worst of all, is the main character is not sufficiently sympathetic. Well, because people are interesting, people are not always sympathetic. And the same person can be sympathetic and unsympathetic, and that makes it a more interesting and a more believable character than somebody who follows, those American guidelines, really, which is you make them sympathetic and active, and they, take decisions, and people aren't like that. So you have to. So what I'm saying is that simultaneously, you have to listen and assess everything that everybody says to you about the script and change it if necessary. But on the other hand, you have to completely fiercely defend what it is in your script that is distinctive to you, and refuse to change that, whatever they say. And it's been my experience that whenever somebody says, well, this is a very strange scene, I don't think this scene works at all, that is the most interesting scene in the film. And that is the scene you have to keep.
What a wonderful ending to this masterclass. Thank you so much, Christopher Hampton.
Thank you.
For sharing your time with us. We have lunch now. Maybe you join us. I don't know. If you want to, by the way, if you want to read more about Christopher Hampton, this is a very nice book. It's about screenwriting. You're in there.
Yes.
Some of your colleagues as well. It's only about.
Right. I'd actually forgotten about that book.
It's really nice.
It came out recently.
Yeah, it's really nice book. You learn a lot about it. It's also about editing. There's a book about directing, but this one's particularly about screenwriting and only about screenwriting. Filmcraft.
My favourite book, by the way, about film is a book by Sidney Lumet called Making.
Sidney Lumet,
the director who died a couple of years ago, called Making Movies. I think it's very clear, great book.
Okay, so now we have lunch, and I wish you a wonderful afternoon, or whoever stays here for the treatment competition.
Making movies.
Hello. And make movies, yes.